Hi, welcome to the Crates Motel. My name's Conan. In today's video, we're going to look at a real-world situation. We're going to use some of the tips and tricks I've shown in previous videos, and we're going to mix down some lo-fi boom bap drums in the MPC. Let's jump in. So this is a sketch I was working on this morning. What I like to do in the MPC is kind of get a ballpark sound to the mix before I bounce it to a DAW for a final mix down. Sometimes I like it exactly as it is in the MPC and I'll bounce it wet. But at the very least, I want to kind of, when I'm sketching, is just kind of get a sound to the actual track. Just have a quick listen. So fairly standard stuff, lo-fi boom bap drums, contemporary 60s jazz type sample. This is what it sounded like before I processed the drums. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to go through the mix down on the actual drums and explain some of my decisions, explain the processing that I use on the drum bus and on the individual drums, just to give you a kind of idea how I mix down drums. Now when I'm mixing for a client or for myself, 99.99999% of the time I will start with the drums, and what I will do is I will start with the drum bus to kind of get an overall sound for the drums and to put the drums in the same space. The reason I say it like that is because a lot of the time we're using sample packs, the kicks and the snares and the hats, etc., from different sources, and sometimes they sound a little bit disjointed. And what I like to do personally is I like to try and put them in the same space. I'll use a mixture of compression, a little bit of reverb, some EQ, some lo-fi effects, some saturation, and I just basically want to put the drums in the same place so there's a bit of cohesion and they sound gelled and together. So what I'll do is I'll start off with the drum bus. Let's just go into that here. Let's turn these off. First thing I do is I hit some compression. The reason for that is, firstly I use the air compressor because it's quite transparent. The reason for that is before I do any other processing, I want to kind of gel the drums. I want to, the drums rather, I want to add a little bit of glue to the drums. So not a massively high ratio. I don't really want to hear the compression. I just want to glue the drums together. Not a massively high ratio. A long attack because I want to let the transients through. I don't want it to sound squashed most of the time. Short release, so you got that kind of punch. I'll keep it on 100% mix and I'll be literally hitting 2-3 decibels maximum of gain reduction. If you concentrate on the snare, what happens is when I bring the compressor in, the snare goes from sort of poking out to being sort of squashed onto the kick drum, which is the exact kind of effect I want to have. I want it to sound like it was recorded in the same space. So let's just have a listen one more time. So then I go into some EQ. I use the power EQ. Now bear in mind I'm not doing any surgical EQ here. This is a broad EQ decision. I want to give a little bit of bottom end. I want to clear up a little bit of the mud because there's more than likely there's going to be a little bit of mud around about between 180 and 260 just from samples, from vinyl rumble, from some of the natural reverb from the drums, etc. And then just probably a little bit of clarity, and because it's lo-fi I don't really want to put too much tops on it. So I've used high pass and low pass. I've rolled off right at the bottom 22 Hertz because there was a tiny little bit of vinyl rumble on there that I could pick up on my headphones. So very, very slight, just rolled off the bottom end, and I rolled off the top end because, you know, I want that kind of lo-fi sound. In the EQ, I've boosted a little bit of 65 Hertz because that's kind of where the fundamental of the kick drum was. As I said, I've rolled off a little bit of 250 where there was a little bit of mud. little bit of clarity at 2.5, and just a tiny little bit of top end. It was more to give the drums a bit of air rather than actually trying to, like, you know, EQ specific parts of the drum beat. So it's very, very subtle. Probably the obvious part is the little bit of mud that I've just scooped out at 250. Okay, so next I'm going to air flavour. What I've done, very, very small amount, as you can see, 14%. I've monofied the drums a little bit because I just want them tight, a bit tighter, a bit front and centre. I've added a little bit of an amp bass. Listen to the kick drum, and most of all actually listen to what happens with the snare. With the snare, it kind of gives it a nice warm kind of mid-range and a bit of body as well. It's doing a little bit to the bass, to the kick drum, but I'll show you what I did to the kick drum to really kind of add some beef to that. But again, very, very subtle. I had it on about 50% to start with, and I kind of just dialed it back to almost the point where you can't hear it. I've also added a little bit of the distortion and noise in there as well, which is supposed to be a vinyl simulation. Does it sound like vinyl? You know, I don't really care, but I do like the little bit of distortion that I've added to it. So, I mean, they call it vinyl. I'm not so sure, but it sounds nice. And if it sounds nice, then, you know, go with it. Right at the end, if you watch my videos, you'll see that I do this a lot. MPC 60. And as I've said in all of my other videos, does it make it sound like an MPC 60? I don't care, but what I do like is the bottom end that it adds, the warmth that it adds to the low mids, and I just kind of like the way that it almost adds a kind of tape saturation in the high end, probably around about 12 kilohertz, maybe a little bit higher. I'm thinking maybe 13 kilohertz because that was where some of the filters were on things like the SP1200, where it would roll off the anti-aliasing. So possibly, I don't know, but I like how it sounds. I'll take it out, then I'll drop it back in. Let your ears get used to it. Really notice it on the kick drum. It just adds a really nice bit of tape saturation. So if anything, I think of more of this MPC 60 at the end of my chain as a tape saturation plugin rather than trying to make it sound like an MPC 60. So I'll drop it out again and listen to the kick drum. It almost has a kind of distorted sound, but it isn't distortion, it's saturation, low end saturation, and it just gives it a really nice, like when, I don't know how much you might know about using tape, reel-to-reel tape, but what we quite often used to do is we would drive it into the red on purpose because you would get this lovely breakup, this lovely warm analog distortion. Is this an emulation of that? I can't say. Obviously it's digital, it's not analog. But it has a very similar kind of sound and a similar kind of feel to it. And I like it, and that's why I use the MPC 60. So get used to it without. Okay, so that's the work on the drum bus. But then what I've done, if you go into individual pads, with the kick drum, as you can see, no effects on there. But if you go into drum effects, which is in program edit, right at the end of the program edit, you start off with global, go right to the end, hit this twice, and you have drum effects. I've done a video on it. So what I've done with the kick drum is I've used Decimator and the Bit Crush just to really kind of dirty up the kick drum and kind of get it in a SP1200 12-bit kind of area. Not sounding exactly like it, but it gets it in the area. But then, and I absolutely love this on the drum effects, this bass wide, adding this to kick drums, it just sounds so good. So there it is without. Still sounds pretty decent, but listen as I bring it up. what it does is almost adding a little bit of stereo information to the kick, which is not really necessarily something that you want to do. But what it most of all is doing is it's just making the kick drum sound bigger, girthier, weightier. And, you know, that was really what I wanted. You know, this is boom bap, and I want the kick drum to be round, warm, and big in the mix. So coming back out again, let's go to the snare drum. Snare drum, I use the Air Channel Strip. Air Channel Strip's great because it has some filters, a gate, compressor and EQ all in one plugin. So you're using less plugins, less processing power. So a little bit of compression I used on the snare. What I've done here is I've kind of emulated a compressor that I've been using on snares for years called the DBX160. It's kind of famous for snappy, punchy snare drums. I absolutely love it on drums. So I've got the ratio at 3:4. I could go up to around about 4, but it sounded nice here. Again, I've let the transient through with a longer attack, and then I've gone for a short release. So I've got a nice bit of punch on the snare, and I'm doing about 3 or 4 decibels of gain reduction. It's taking away a little bit of the crispiness of the snare drum and just kind of rounding it off a little bit, and just giving it a little bit more snap and a bit more punch. Subtle, just a nice little bit of warmth in there. I love it. And then with the EQ, I've actually rolled off some of the highs, and I've brought up a little bit of 215. Now on snare drums, round about 180 to 260 is where you get a lot of the body on snares. A mistake a lot of people make with just mixing in general is adding high pass filters, take it all the way up to 260, take it all the way up to 400, and you lose the body on some instruments. Snare drums especially, you need a little bit of, you know, unless you want that really kind of tinny, snappy kind of snare drum. But I want a bit of beef in there. I want it to kind of sound old. I want it lo-fi. So I want to have some body in the snare drum. So I've done a little bit of a boost there at 215. And just rolling that off just gives it a little bit more crunch and a little bit more warmth. Into the clap. So, and you're probably starting to hear something which I'll explain in a second. With the clap, didn't really use any compression because it's from a sample pack and it sounds like it's been compressed already, so I didn't feel the need to use that. Rolled off a little bit of the low end. I've added a little bit of 1800 because it was a bit dull and I wanted to bring it forward in the mix without actually adjusting the volume. A really good way of bringing up instruments, especially drums, in the mix without actually applying any more volume to it is to EQ in the mix, in the context. Don't do it in solo. So what I've done here is quite a heavy boost, 5 decibels at 1800. You see it's bringing out the low mids into the mids, probably actually more mids. Let's go into the hi-hats. Don't think I really did an awful lot with the hi-hats. I've rolled off some of the low end. I've added a little bit of 6K. Again, it's more air that I'm adding rather than kind of top end. I don't really want to add too much top end, and I just found that with around about 6K on these particular hi-hats, it just kind of added a little bit of air without making it sound too sort of tinny. Coming out, going into the tambourine, rolled off the low end, added a little bit of 5.5. Again, that would have been for more air rather than top end. Small adjustments, you know. Okay, so in this shaker sound, This is a trick that I've been using for absolutely years on sampled shakers to add a little bit of movement in the drums and just make it sound a little bit more natural. Look, we all know that that's not a guy going like that with a shaker. We know that it's a sample. You know, you make that, you can make that distinction from the type of beat that it is. Maybe I have got somebody to come in and play percussion, but 9 times out of 10 it's going to be a sample of somebody playing percussion, but you're just going to loop a small part. But to create a little bit of movement, I've used the auto pan just at a quarter, and what it basically does, not fully wet, is it kind of gives the impression that it's kind of going backwards and forwards like that, which is not necessarily what a shaker does, but in the beat it adds a little bit of movement. If you've got headphones on, you'll hear it. If you've got a sound system or you're listening to it on a phone, then perhaps you won't. But just listen to the way that the hats, because I haven't got it fully wet, there's a bit of dry signal coming in. It's very, very subtle, but it just adds a little bit of movement to the beat. Humanises it as such. You can hear it now. I also didn't play the velocity all the way in, and it swung slightly as well. It wasn't at full level, so the velocity is kind of changing. It swung just a little bit, and then with that auto pan, it just adds a little bit of movement. EQ wise, rolled a little bit of low end off, added a bit of clarity, not done really anything else with it, to be honest. Taken a little bit of the low end off, and that's it. You know, these are very, very subtle changes. The reason is, a lot of the time, if you're using sample packs especially, the production team behind the sample pack have already done a pretty decent job of EQing it and compressing it, etc. I would do a lot more work if these were from vinyl. The kick drum, it's on solo, sorry, my bad. The kick drum is off vinyl, and the snare drum is off vinyl as well. And so the last thing I did, just to add that last little bit of magic and bring the drums all into the same space as each other, is I added some reverb. But I didn't just go for just a standard reverb. What I have set up on my templates most of the time is on the insert 1, on the returns, I have a reverb, and on return 2 I have a delay. Because having it as a return effect rather than having individual inserts on each one of your tracks, one of your sounds, etc. One, it takes up less CPU and RAM, and 2, if you're going for a reverb, an overall reverb, to kind of get that gelled kind of sound where everything's in the same space, you want to be sending it all to the same reverb, in the same way that they did in the old studios when they would send everything to a plate reverb, etc, etc. But what I've done on this, because the beats are kind of like a lo-fi boom bap style, but I want that kind of late 60s, early 70s funk edge, rather than use a plate reverb, because back in those days the only studios that tended to have plate reverbs were the big major studios. Abbey Road had legendary plate reverbs. Capitol, the Motown studios, those kind of places, they have plates, but most of the funk music that we know from the 60s and 70s were recorded in, how can I say, cheaper studios. So they would have had things like spring reverbs. They would have used a spring reverb on Fender amps, etc., things like that. So to get that kind of sound, rather than use a plate reverb, etc., which I would normally use actually if I was doing vocals and stuff, I wanted to capture that real late 60s authentic sound. So I've used a spring reverb. The Air Spring reverb is great. Short pre-delay, 4 seconds timing on it. I use the mix kind of, because it's a return. You would normally have that on 100% mix, but what I've done is I kind of use that as a volume knob almost, just to get it dialed in. So that's why it's on 50% rather than 100. Little bit of EQ afterwards. Literally all I'm doing is taking the low end off and the high end off, just because reverbs have a tendency to muddy things up. You don't need the low end and you don't really need the highs either, because sometimes it can create a bit too much sort of side information. So I've made the decision there to take it down from 10k and 600 hertz. So the only things that are using it are the snares and the claps, as far as I'm aware. Let's just have a look in the pad mix. Yes, you can hear the snare and the clap. And you can sort of hear that kind of spring reverb sound. And that's really what I wanted to do. I did try a normal plate reverb, but it just sounded a little bit too posh and a little bit too sort of, you know, clean. What's really nice about the spring reverb is, you know, think of James Brown, think of the meters, think of late 60s, early 70s, like rare funk that you find in some, you know, secondhand record shop from the early 70s. It's gritty. There was only 500 copies pressed. It was made in someone's garage, and the only reverb they had was a spring. And what that's doing is it's putting the drums in the same space as each other, because, you know, in effect what I've done is I've created a space using that reverb. It's not necessarily something that you really hear. My point here isn't to go, hey everyone, listen to this reverb I've added. My point is to get the drums sounding like they're in the same space, with compression, with EQ, and then finally with the reverb at the end. So that's it with nothing on. So there you have it. Now I quite often work this way. I will do the sketch in the MPC, I will do some EQ and some compression and some effects in the MPC, and then I'll bounce it to my DAW and finish it off. Sometimes I'll bounce it completely wet out of the MPC because I like how I've got it to sound in there. Sometimes I'll get in the ballpark and then, you know, I'll bounce it to the DAW and do it and finish it off in there. I would love it if you're inspired by some of the techniques and some of the processes I've used, but feel free to copy some of the chains, etc. But do bear in mind that every single mix is different. If you copy the numbers exactly from this, it's not going to make your mix sound great. You know, it's not going to translate. So use the techniques and the processing chains, etc. But you're going to have to tweak them for your own personal mix. So thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more mixing, mastering and MPC tutorials and reviews. This is the Crates Motel. My name's Conan. Until next time.